The sky is on fire. Artillery screams across the valley like the world itself is tearing apart. Men dive for cover, dust, smoke, chaos swallowing everything. And through that storm, she appears. A small red mare, mane scorched by wind, eyes locked forward, shells bursting around her, ground shaking beneath her hooves, yet she doesn't stop. Step after step, calm, steady, fearless. On her back, ammunition, the lifeline of men, too pinned down to move. She doesn't need orders. She doesn't need courage explained. She is courage. While soldiers bow their heads and pray, this little mare keeps walking, right through the fire, into the heart of war. She wasn't just a horse, she was a Marine. The war hadn't reached every home yet, but its shadow had already found every heart. In a quiet Korean village, before the smoke and the sirens, a small mare was born. Short-legged, strong-backed, her coat shone the color of morning fire. They called her Chim, Flame of the Morning. She belonged to a boy named Kim Moon, barely more than a child himself. He brushed her every day with hands still too small for war. He whispered secrets into her mane, promising her a lifetime of green fields and gentle rain. But promises mean little when hunger knocks at the door. The year was 1952. The Korean War thundered closer, and families were trading memories for survival. Kim's father was gone, his mother ill, and food almost gone. One day, Marines arrived, rough voices, foreign faces, searching for a horse strong enough to carry ammunition up the hills. They offered $250, enough to keep a family alive through the winter. But it meant letting go of the one creature that still felt like hope. Kim wrapped his arms around Chim Hai's neck, burying his face in her mane, trying not to cry where the soldiers could see. She nuzzled him once, as if she understood. He whispered her name one last time, Flame of the Morning, and stepped back. The Marines led her away. With each hoofbeat she took, the boy's world grew quieter. He didn't know it yet, but the little mare he'd loved would soon walk into history, carrying more than ammunition, carrying the spirit of everyone who's ever had to say goodbye so that someone else could live. The little mare's journey from innocence to war began with a handshake. Lieutenant Eric Pedersen, United States Marine Corps, $250 for one small horse. A bargain made in desperation, sealed by duty. The Marines led her into a world of noise and iron. Gone were the rice paddies and the boy's soft voice. Now there were boots, engines, and the thump of recoilless rifles echoing off the hills. They renamed her Reckless after the weapon she would serve. It wasn't meant as a compliment. It was a description of the men and machines she was about to follow into chaos. From the first day, she watched everything. How the Marines moved, where they stepped, when they ducked. She learned fast, because survival has no patience for slow learners. They taught her to step over signal wires without tangling her legs, to lie down when artillery screamed overhead, to freeze when someone shouted, "Incoming!" She memorized the trails that wound up the mountains like scars, and she learned to trust the rough hands that guided her. At night, they fed her scraps of bread, apples from their rations, talked to her like she could understand. And maybe she did. She began to nudge them gently with her nose, searching their pockets for treats and their faces for calm. In the middle of a war, a bond began to grow. One side offered discipline, the other, loyalty. And somewhere between the two, a horse became a Marine. War zones don't leave much room for laughter, but somehow she made space for it. By now, the little mare had earned her new name, Reckless, and she was living up to it. In all the best and worst ways. She learned faster than anyone expected. She could weave through barbed wire like she'd drawn the path herself, duck at the sound of incoming, and stand perfectly still when shells hit close. But when the danger faded, that's when her real personality showed. She'd nose open tent flaps just to see what the men were doing. If there was food, it was hers. Eggs, gone. Bread, vanished. Poker night, she'd wander in, chew on a helmet liner, and swallow a few poker chips for good luck. And the Marines? They couldn't stay mad. They tried discipline, but who can scold a face like that? Reckless had already mastered the most powerful weapon in any platoon. Charm. She'd sneak sips of Coca-Cola straight from the can, and if someone wasn't watching their beer, well, she'd share that too. Her appetite was legendary. Eggs, bacon, even coffee, nothing was safe. But when the shouting started, when orders came down, and the sound of war returned, she was all focus. She'd lift her head, ears forward, waiting for her handler's signal. One word, one touch, and she moved like she'd been born for it. Mischievous when it was safe, fearless when it mattered. The Marines began saying it with pride. She's one of the boys. The hills of Korea were no place for beginners. The air smelled of cordite and cold rain, the kind that bites your lungs. For the first time, Reckless was loaded with the weight of war. Shells stacked high across her small, red back. She shifted once, testing the ropes, then looked to the Marines. A single word. Go. And she went. The trail was steep, carved from mud and rock, curling up the mountain like a scar. Each step sank, slipped, caught again. Men stumbled. She didn't. Explosions cracked open the silence, shockwaves rolling through the ground. Shrapnel hissed past like angry bees. Still, she climbed, ears flicking toward the voices that guided her. She was learning to trust their shouts, their whistles, their steady hands reaching through smoke. By the second trip, she no longer waited for orders. When the call came for more ammunition, she turned on her own, heading back down the trail as if she'd done it all her life. Shells roared above her, echoing off the ridges, but Reckless never flinched. Her breathing stayed even, her stride sure. A Marine watching her shook his head in disbelief. Reckless doesn't spook, he said quietly. She just keeps moving. And that's how the legend began. Not with fanfare, not with medals, but with one small mare walking through hell, carrying the lifeline of a platoon on her back, and proving with every hoofstep that courage sometimes comes wrapped in chestnut hair and silence. February 1953. The Korean hills of Outpost Vegas are burning. The sky is torn open, thunder made of steel raining down. Shells explode with no rhythm, just chaos, constant and cruel. The air is thick with dust and screams. Men press themselves into the earth, praying the next round won't find them. And through that inferno comes the sound of hoofbeats, small, steady, unbroken. It's Reckless. Her mane is matted with ash, her eyes locked forward, her body already trembling from the weight strapped across her back. Boxes of ammunition, each one a lifeline for the Marines pinned above her. She starts up the slope alone. No lead rope, no hesitation. The ground shakes, the air bites, yet she climbs. An explosion tears open the hill beside her. Shrapnel slices across her flank, another gash above her eye. She stumbles, catches herself, lifts her head, and keeps moving. At the ridge, she waits long enough for the Marines to unload the shells, their hands shaking as they touch her blood-streaked coat. Someone whispers, "She's still going?" She turns herself around and heads back down the same hellish trail, trip after trip, 51 times in one day, 9,000 pounds of ammunition. No handler, no fear, no quit. When the supply dumps run dry, she changes her cargo. Wounded men, broken bodies draped across her back, the little mare walking them down to safety while fire still rains behind her. Each run slower than the last, each step heavier, but she never stops. Her ears flick toward the front, her breathing ragged, her will untouched. To the Marines, she isn't just a horse anymore. She's the heartbeat of the hill. And when the guns finally fall silent, when the smoke lifts and daylight finds what's left of Outpost Vegas, they see her standing there, legs trembling, coat caked in mud and blood, but her head still high. One Marine takes off his helmet and salutes her. Another follows, then another. No words, just respect. Because on that day, in that storm of fire, one small mare did the work of many men and proved that courage can walk on four legs. The battlefield finally fell quiet. Smoke drifted low, and the echoes of war faded into the cold Korean wind. Among the twisted metal and the shattered earth stood a small mare, mud-caked, bleeding, exhausted, but alive. Her legs trembled, her sides rose and fell like bellows, and still her eyes stayed calm. Reckless had done what no one thought possible. The Marines gathered around her, men who had seen everything war could do, and yet they looked at her with awe. Someone brought water. Another wrapped her wounds with torn bandages. A third slipped her an apple, the only sweetness left in a world of dust and blood. Someone else handed over a chocolate bar. She chewed it slowly, as if savoring peace itself. They tended her with a gentleness they didn't even know they had left. Because this wasn't just a horse. This was family. This was one of their own. Word spread fast through the platoon. Reckless made it. Command heard. Stories multiplied. How she'd made 51 runs in a single day, carried wounded men through fire, never once turned back. Soon, the paperwork came down. Promotion, Corporal Reckless, and not long after, Sergeant Reckless, a horse saluted by Marines, a uniform tailored for a creature that could not speak, but had said more with her actions than most men ever could. They pinned her ribbons carefully, the Purple Heart for wounds under fire, the Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal for service beyond duty, the United Nations Service Medal for her part in the global fight for peace. When the orders were read aloud, someone in the ranks chuckled softly. "She outranks me now." No one argued. They all knew the truth. She'd earned every stripe. In a war that took so much, she had given something back. Faith, pride, and the reminder that courage doesn't always walk on two legs. The year was 1954. After everything she had endured, the fire, the noise, the endless climbs, Reckless boarded a ship bound for a new world. For the first time in years, there were no explosions, no shouting, no smell of gunpowder, only the sound of the ocean and the soft creak of the deck beneath her hooves. She was going home, not to the boy who had once loved her, but to a nation waiting to meet its newest hero. When she arrived in the United States, she was greeted not with silence, but with applause. Crowds gathered at the docks. Reporters jostled for a closer look. Flashes from cameras popped like tiny bursts of lightning. But Reckless didn't seem to notice. She stood quietly, ears flicking, eyes calm. as if she'd seen too much to ever be startled again. From that day forward, she was no longer just a warhorse. She was America's Marine. She marched proudly in parades, her medals gleaming in the sunlight, her name called out alongside the bravest soldiers in the world. She appeared on television, in magazines, and in newspapers from coast to coast, a symbol of courage, loyalty, and the bond between a warrior and their comrades. Children reached out to touch her, veterans saluted as she passed. Everywhere she went, people smiled, and sometimes they cried. Because in her presence, they saw something pure, the proof that bravery isn't about size or species, it's about heart. At Camp Pendleton, Reckless found peace. Green pastures replaced the sound of gunfire. The Marines built her a stable, tended her every need, and spoke to her like she was still part of the unit, because to them, she always would be. Each morning, she would nicker softly as the Marines passed by, and they would tip their caps and greet her. "Morning, Sergeant," a title she wore with quiet pride. After surviving the roar of war, Reckless became the voice of its quiet aftermath, a living legend who reminded the world what loyalty looks like when it's written not in words, but in courage. At Camp Pendleton, the war slowly faded into memory, and peace finally found her. Reckless spent her days beneath the California sun, grazing in open fields where the wind carried no echoes of battle. The Marines who cared for her never treated her as an exhibit or a relic. She was a fellow Marine, one who had already earned her rest. Each morning, the gate would swing open, and she'd walk out to the pasture, her steps slower now, but still deliberate, still proud. Marines visited often, slipping her apples, brushing her coat, telling new recruits, "That's Sergeant Reckless, the bravest of us all." She'd lift her head when she heard their voices, ears twitching, eyes soft with recognition. Even in old age, that spark of discipline remained. She still came when called, still listened like a soldier awaiting her orders. The years rolled by gently. The little mare, who had once climbed through hell, now lived surrounded by calm. No gunfire, no shouting, only the rhythm of waves in the distance and the rustle of grass beneath her hooves. The Marines joked that she had finally found her permanent post, guarding the base with quiet grace. In 1968, the inevitable came. Her body had grown tired, but her spirit never dimmed. On a clear day at Camp Pendleton, Sergeant Reckless took her final breath. The news spread quickly through the barracks. Grown men who had seen war bowed their heads in silence. They buried her there, with full military honors, the flag draped across her casket, the bugles sounding taps, the Marines standing at attention, not because of tradition, but because of love. Her tombstone still stands, etched with the words that capture her truth. Reckless, a hero in every sense of the word. And beneath that California sky, the earth holds the remains of a horse who carried not just ammunition, but the weight of humanity's best qualities: duty, courage, and an unbreakable heart. Her story didn't end with the closing of her stable door. At Camp Pendleton, where she once grazed and slept under the California sun, a bronze statue now stands in her place. Ears alert, head high, her pack saddle full of ammunition. She faces the horizon, as if still watching over the Marines she once followed into war. Another statue stands at the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Virginia, where visitors stop, fall quiet, and read the plaque that bears her name: Sergeant Reckless. Tourists see a statue. Veterans see a memory. They remember the smell of smoke, the thunder of guns, and a small red mare who walked into all of it without hesitation. Mothers lift their children up to touch her bronze muzzle, and in that moment, another generation meets courage. Reckless remains the only animal ever officially promoted to Staff Sergeant in the history of the United States Marine Corps. She was more than a mascot, more than a miracle. She was proof that bravery doesn't ask for language or rank. It simply is. They say time buries stories, but some refuse to fade. Reckless carried more than ammunition. She carried courage on her back and love in her heart. She carried the spirit of every Marine who ever stood their ground when fear said to run. And even now, decades later, that spirit still marches. When the wind sweeps through Camp Pendleton's hills, it passes the monument and whispers through the grass, sounding almost like hoofbeats. Maybe that's imagination. Or maybe it's her, still on duty, still walking the line. Because heroes come in many forms. Some wear boots, others wear horseshoes.